could take your seats, we'd like to get started with Panel 3, Issues in Food Retailing. This afternoon, we are going to add to the already wonderful discussion that went on this morning and talk about issues in food retailing. With the increasing consolidation in the retail sector, specifically in certain regions, it's raised questions about the impact on consumer prices and viability of smaller stores to compete and the impact on suppliers down the marketing chain. There's also been some changes in industry structure and some new trends that we're going to touch on. I am delighted today to be joined by panelists of all kinds and from all different organizations, and I'm a little worried we put the two economists side by side, so we'll have to sort that out as we go forward. Let me start by introducing the panelists, and then Howard Shelanski is going to tee up the issues for us, and then we're going to go through a question and answer and hopefully have a really fulsome dialogue about what I think are very important issues that we face in the agricultural context and in retailing, food retailing. So I will start and introduce Howard. Howard Shelanski is the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, where he's responsible for the Bureau's antitrust portfolio. Since 1997, he's been a professor of law at University of California, Berkeley. Howard recently joined the faculty at Georgetown Law Center, from which he's on leave while at the FTC. His research focuses on antitrust and regulation. Howard has twice before served in government as the senior economist at the President's Council of Economic Advisors and as chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. Before joining the Berkeley faculty, he practiced law in Washington, D.C., served as a law clerk to Justice Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Lewis Pollack in the District Court of Philadelphia, Judge Stephen Williams on the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. Dr. Shelanski earned his J.D. and Ph.D. in economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and his B.A. from Haverford College. Welcome, Howard. To my far right is Bert Fohr, a very familiar face to us antitrusters, and we're so pleased you're here today, Bert. Bert is the president of the American Antitrust Institute. His career has included private practice in Washington, D.C. at my old stomping ground, Hogan and Hartson, and also at Jackson and Campbell. He has also served in various positions in the federal government. Bert was the assistant director and acting deputy director at the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Competition. He's also CEO of a mid-sized chain of jewelry stores for 12 years, had trade association and nonprofit leadership. He's also taught antitrust to undergraduate and graduate business students. Bert has published a number of articles, book chapters, and reviews related to competition policy, including, in particular for us today, the topic of buyer power. He's a graduate of University of Chicago Law School and magna cum laude from Brandeis, and also an MA in political science from Washington University, my law school. Next to Bert is Winona Howder. Winona, welcome. Winona is the Executive Director of Food and Water Watch. She has worked extensively on energy, food, water, and environmental issues at the national, state, and local level. She's experienced in developing policy position and legislative strategies, also skilled and accomplished organizer, having lobbied and developed grassroots field strategy and action plans. From 1997 to 2005, she served as the Director of Public Citizen, their energy and environment program, which focuses on water, food, and energy policy. From 1996 to 1997, she was the environmental policy director at Citizen Action, where she worked with the organization's 30 state-based groups. And then before that, she was with the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she was a senior organizer coordinating broad-based grassroots sustainable energy campaign in several states. She has her MS in Applied Anthropology from University of Maryland. Welcome, Winona. Next to Winona is Mary Hendricks. Mary is from my home state of Missouri, so I'm thrilled that she's here as well. Go Mizzou. I can't help myself. Mary is an Extension Associate Professor in Rural Sociology and Director of Food Circles Networking Project at the University of Missouri. Her research and extension program focuses on understanding the changes taking place in the global food system and helps farmers, eaters, and communities create profitable alternatives. Dr. Hendrickson serves as the Associate Director for the University of Missouri Community Food Systems and Sustainable Agriculture Program. She's also served as President of the Agriculture, Food, and Human Values Society and as President of the Community Food Security Coalition. Dr. Hendricks is a recipient of the 2002 Cooperative Services Award presented by the National Farmers Union. She holds a B.S. in agribusiness from the University of Nebraska and a master's and Ph.D. in rural sociology from the University of Missouri. Welcome, Mary. To my right is Eric Lieberman. Those of you who were here this morning saw Eric and heard his bio in the Food Marketing Institute. We are so pleased that you're here. We know that you did a lot of work, and I won't repeat your bio if that's okay. That's we'll move along so we get to the good stuff. I'll move on to Kyle. If I find my notes here, here we go. Kyle is Professor Steigert is the director of the Food System Research Group at the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. Kyle is widely published in economics and agricultural economics and food journals. His research interests include investigating the competitive structures of agricultural markets, trade policy, issues in international agriculture, competition, and policy in food retailing. So welcome, Kyle. We're so glad you're here. Okay, let me find my other, sorry, I'm fumbling around a little bit here. Al, I'm looking for your bio. I want everybody to get credit for all that they've done here. Al Vincent Jr. is the International Vice President and Director of Region 2 of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, which represents over 1.4 million members in the United States and Canada. Mr. Vincent has been with the UFCW International since 1990. However, he first became a member of Local 204 in Charlotte, North Carolina, while employed at AMP. Before being named in his current position, he served as the International Representative and Collective Bargaining Representative of the National Poultry Coordinator, Executive Assistant of the New York Region, and Assistant to the National Director of Organizing and Director of Regional 5 South Central. Mr. Vincent serves as the Executive Vice President and Chairman of the UFCW Minority Coalition Scholarship Fund. He's a member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unions and serves on the board of directors of the Keystone Research Center. He's also a former teaching fellow of the AFL-CIO Institute. Mr. Vincent holds his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of North Carolina and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Baltimore Yale Gordon School of Business. He's also attended Johns Hopkins University Peabody Preparatory School of Music, so we have that as well. We have Tom Winning next to him. Tom is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the National Grocers Association, a national trade association representing the retail and wholesale grocers that comprise the independent sector of the food distribution industry, and has served in this capacity since its inception in 1982. Prior to joining the NGA, he was a partner at a Washington, D.C. law firm of Bison and Winning, and served as General Counsel to the National Association of Retail Grocers of the United States, predecessor to the NGA, and the National Food Brokers Association. Tom is a graduate of the University of Akron School of Law and Miami University, and also a member of the D.C. Bar as well. And to his left, we have Bob Young. Bob, let me find my notes here. I'm fumbling around a little bit. There we go, Bob. Bob joined the American Farm Bureau Federation in 2003 as a chief economist coordinating the activities of the Economic Analysis Team. Dr. Young came to the Farm Bureau from the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, where he was co-director from 1991 to 2003. Before becoming co-director of FAPRI, Bob served as a chief economist of the United States Senate Committee on Agriculture from 1987 through 1991. Bob is a Ph.D. in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri and a B.S. and M.S. in atmospheric sciences from the University of Missouri as well. So another Missourian. I love this. Boy, I feel right at home. Also, Bob's a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve and has toured the South Pacific as well. So welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased that you're here. We got through all those very impressive bios, and I hope you all are as impressed as I am with this panel. I asked Howard if he would sort of kick off our discussion because he's done some really interesting work in food retailing and can identify some of the trends that we're seeing and foster a lot of our discussion. So, Howard, if you could.
Sure. Thanks very much, Charis. I'd like to start by thanking the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Department of Agriculture for inviting me to participate in today's workshop. The issues before us are obviously vital to the country, and they merit, I think, the important leadership the DOJ and the USDA have shown in organizing this and the previous workshops. I'm going to present a brief discussion of some issues related to consolidation in the retail grocery market. And my job here is really just to tee up a number of issues. Coming from an antitrust agency, I'm going to focus on some of the consumer welfare issues that are usually the concern of antitrust, or really the central concern of antitrust. There are obviously very important food safety, labor, and other kinds of issues that I will mention and raise, but that will obviously merit further discussion. Consolidation has been an ongoing process in grocery retailing for many years. USDA data show that the top 20 retailers accounted for about 39% of U.S. grocery sales in 1992. Between 1997 and 2000, more than 4,000 stores were acquired, amounting to almost a fifth of all U.S. supermarkets. And that trend of consolidation has continued. The top 20 grocery stores today account for roughly 65% of U.S. Grocery store sales. So a tremendous increase from that 1992 39% figure. And sales by the 20 largest food retailers totaled approximately $725 billion in 2009, according to Supermarket News. One important contributor, other than mergers and acquisitions, to the increased volume and share of the top 20 retailers over the past 2 decades has been the rapid growth of what are often called non-traditional grocery retailers, like Walmart, Target, and Costco. Walmart's food and non-food grocery sales amounted to an estimated $258 billion in 2010, according to Supermarket News, making Walmart the largest U.S. retailer of grocery products. In comparison, second place Kroger, which is the largest traditional grocery retailer, had estimated sales of $77 billion in this 2010 year. Many studies and commentaries show that this growth and consolidation has helped food retailers to reduce costs and made grocery retailing more efficient. Non-traditional grocery retailers have prices that are, on average, 7.5% below the prices of traditional supermarkets for identical products and packaging, according to a USDA Economic Research Service study. Consolidation and growth through productivity increases may make it harder, however, for smaller grocery stores to stay in business and may decrease the margins earned by suppliers to large grocery chains. And I include in suppliers not just farms and manufacturers, but those of you who supply your labor to those chains. Smaller chains and independents have been seen to exit some markets in which Walmart has entered. Monopsony, the power of buyers, can become a concern when buying power becomes concentrated in too few hands. Although reduced payments to upstream suppliers may not harm and instead can benefit final consumers when benefit is measured in terms of their food bills. So some of the buying power that agricultural producers may confront along the supply chain may be beyond the scope of traditional antitrust enforcement. That's not to say that monopsony is not an antitrust concern. It is just, as many have acknowledged, a very difficult issue for antitrust because what amounts to lower payments upstream can lead to lower prices downstream. The available evidence we have examined does not show that changes in the retail grocery markets have been bad for consumers when measured in terms of consumers' food bills. The Consumer Price Index for food at home, which roughly includes all food, prepared and otherwise, sold by grocery stores, has tracked closely but just below the overall Consumer Price Index for the U.S. economy over the last 30 years. The Producer Price Index for retail grocery stores has risen steadily but modestly for the past decade, which as long as the Bureau of Labor Statistics has reported data on grocery retailing. The retail grocery PPI has been in the mid-range of PPIs for other industries. For example, it lies below the overall manufacturing PPI and the finished consumer goods PPI, but above the farm products and crude foodstuffs PPI. One question that might arise from the fact that the retail grocery services PPI is above the farm products and crude foodstuffs PPIs is whether grocery retailers have gained market power that allows them to squeeze the margins of their suppliers without passing through the savings to consumers. The economic evidence, however, suggests some other explanations for the retail grocery producer price index. First, supermarkets have increased their provision of value-added services over time. The price index for farm goods includes lettuce, cucumbers, corn, wheat, etc. The price index for supermarkets a generation ago included such commodities, but now captures much more of such items as bagged salad, processed foods, salad bar sales, prepared meals, and gourmet items. One would therefore expect the price index based on supermarket sales to diverge over time from the price index for farm goods, because what supermarkets sell has diverged increasingly from farm goods over time. Second, the wholesale costs that BLS subtracts from retail revenues to measure the margin on retail grocery services do not include an important set of variable costs, notably processing and food preparation costs a grocery retailer itself incurs. So the cost of in-store baking, cooking, or other food preparation may not be counted in the higher grocery retailing PPI. As a result, the retail grocery producer price index may appear artificially high. Retail grocers have in fact been increasing the proportion of total sales made up of post-wholesale value-added products. This increase in sales of retailer prepared food is consistent with data showing that consumers have been steadily increasing the proportion of commercially prepared food in their overall food-at-home budgets. Compared to the producer price index for other links in the chain of food supply, from farmers to consumers, the retail grocery PPI lies below the PPIs for food manufacturing and finished consumer goods, for example. Changes in the market structure for retail groceries, therefore, do not translate into a simple story of increased market power over consumers, even if the power of those increasingly large buyers, that is to say the grocery retailers, may be felt in various upstream markets. If one measures consumer welfare by the variety of products and services consumers receive from retail grocers and from the prices they are charged, we do not see evidence of a general decrease in consumer welfare from retail grocery consolidation. A broader set of policy considerations might take into account important issues related to the effects of consolidation on market structure in other parts of the food supply chain, and address food security and safety, labor, and environmental concerns. This overview is focused only on the question of market power through consolidation of the retail grocery segment. It is prevention of such market power that is the central concern of the antitrust agencies. But I look forward to hearing some comments on these other issues as well as this panel goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you for teeing up those issues. And now I think it's our job, panelists, to unpackage those a little bit if we could. So I would like to, I think it's a great foundation for us. What I'd like to do is turn to Winona and to Bob. And I know your organizations have been involved in looking at these issues as well. And if you could comment or elaborate on some of the points that Howard made. Winona, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, the consolidation of the last 2 decades has created a food chain that's shaped like an hourglass. We have a large number of very powerful companies that stand between 300 million citizens and 2 million farmers. And the retail consolidation is one of the tightest links in that chain. The dominant grocery stores of the 1980s were gobbled up in the 1990s, as we've heard from Howard, and we had about 100 mergers a year. By 2009, Walmart, Kroger, Costco, and SuperValu controlled more than 51% of sales, more than double the 4-firm concentration of a dozen years earlier. And on the local level, that consolidation and lack of competition is even higher. In 1998, the 4 largest retailers controlled 72% of sales in the 100 largest metro areas. Today, that figure is considerably higher. Walmart alone has more than 50% market share in 29 markets. And consumers haven't benefited from this increased efficiency that's been touted by the industry. And I'd like to begin by correcting a misimpression that I think Eric left us with this morning. That figure that 5.5% of a consumer's budget is spent on food. This figure is of food eaten at home, and it also includes earned income along with non-cash benefits, things like food stamps and rent subsidies. 9% of all food that's home and restaurant, or rather 9% of income is spent on all food, home and restaurant, and that's earned and non-cash benefits. If you subtract the non-cash benefits from that, that's the food stamps and rent subsidies, 11% of consumers' dollars are being spent at the grocery store. And if you look at people in the United States who make under $39,000, and that's 40% of Americans, 15% of their income goes to food. And this is a very poor measurement anyway, because we've had much higher health care costs, much higher housing costs, and much higher energy costs. So if people are spending less on food, it's because they're spending more on these essential things. In fact, consumer spending on groceries has been on the upswing. Real expenditures in food have risen 12% over the past decade, and food inflation was especially high during 2007 and 2008. These growing prices are especially difficult for low-income consumers. According to a 2008 Congressional Research Service report for Congress, even a 4 or 5% increase in the price of food has a significant impact on lower-income consumers. Today, with 40% of income or households earning $39,000 or less, a small increase can dramatically erode food security. And USDA recently reported that 1 out of 7 households are suffering from hunger, and 1 out of 4 children do not have enough food to eat. At the other end of the food chain, farmers are also suffering. Real inflation-adjusted prices that farmers receive for livestock and crops has been falling for decades, but the savings is not passed on to consumers. In 1990, the farmer received 24 cents of the grocery store dollar. It's now 19 cents. That's a 21% decline. In 1990, out of every dollar spent on beef, 60 cents went to the producer. Now it's 43 cents, down by a third. In 1990, a pork producer received 46 cents out of the dollar. They now receive 25 cents, down by almost 50%. And fruits and vegetables have experienced the same decline. Farmers get only 35 cents of the strawberry dollar and 14 cents of the orange dollar, and they've fallen about a third since the 1990s. And dairy is a good example of consumer prices increasing while farm gate prices decrease. When milk prices fell during the latter half of 2009, the consumer price of milk fell only by 22%, and the price of cheese actually went up 6%. So sometimes farm gate prices rise slightly, but consumer prices rise much faster. For example, ground beef prices increased 24% between 1999 and 2008, but cattle prices rose less than 9%, a third as fast as retail. But you know, we can throw out all of our statistics, and all we need to do is ask our friends and family, Does your grocery store dollar go as far as it used to? And across the board, the answer is going to be yes. The real consumer welfare measurement should be that people have enough food to eat and that farmers are making a living. And I say the system isn't working.
Winona, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for giving us your perspective. I also would like to hear the perspective of the farm and ranch families from Bob Young and from your organization. You've touched on some of the farming issues, Winona, and let's hear from Bob on those issues.
Thank you very much. First, let me say that, whether the number's 6%, 11%, or 12% in terms of what the consumers are spending on food, seems to me like that's a pretty good deal. That they've received a pretty good deal for a number of years, and I think it's just a fact of life. Let me follow up on some of the points that Howard made, if I could, and also that Winona made as well. Farmers' share of the food dollar has shrunk substantially over the course of the last 40 years. It was 37% in 1973 and to 19% that Winona discussed in 2006. Most recently, it's kind of crept back up into the 22% level in the last few months or so. But I'd also tell you out loud to this group that changes in the value of farmers' share is not really particularly indicative of much of anything at all when it gets right down to it. We buy a very different package mix today in the grocery store than we did in 1973. Let's think about chicken as a particularly good example. We don't typically buy all that many fresh whole broilers as our primary source of poultry anymore. One of the real stories in my family is my wife trying to instruct my son over the phone as to how to cut up a whole broiler when he was in seventh grade, and this would have been about 20 years or so ago, trying to get the evening meal put together. Let's also not forget that in 1973 we were kind of just beginning the whole microwave boom. I can remember buying our first microwave in 1974. Think about how much shelf space we dedicate today in the grocery store to microwave-ready products, as opposed to how much shelf space we dedicated in 1973. Our consumers are spending much more on service today. And if we look only at market share or our slice of the pie, we're failing to recognize that with product innovation, the whole pie is bigger today than would have been the case without that product innovation. Even so, within product categories, farmer share can show some remarkable resiliency. In 2000, the farmer share of the beef dollar was 48%. For 2001, it's probably going to average 47%. For 2000, the farm share of dairy averaged 30%. And for the first half of 2001, it has averaged 30%. Finally, let me say that in 1973, labor and farm-supplied inputs combined to account for about two-thirds of the consumer food dollar. The farm share was about 37%. Labor accounted for about 29%. In 2006, the last easily available set of data, the two combined to account for about 57% of the food dollar. Agriculture's share in that year was 18%, while labor's share had ballooned to 39%. This is not a poke at the labor sector of food processing. Rather, it's to point out that we are providing much more of the food processing out of the home today than used to be supplied in the kitchen in days past. Let's not get too hung up about these changing share values, because they're really not telling you very much about what's going on in the various different processing levels. I will also tell you that they're not necessarily telling you all that much about what's going on at the farm level either. That we need to make sure we understand what's happening to the size of the pie as we go through these changes as well. With that, let me try to get us back on time.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. And Eric, it's only fair, I think, as moderator, I let you respond. Winona had some I'll call them criticisms, maybe, of some of the figures you had this morning.
Sure.
Do you have anything you want to say back?
Yeah, I would like to respond. The argument that food prices have been going up over the past several decades just isn't borne out by the facts. In the 1940s, American families spent about 19% of their income on food. Today, it's 5.5%. And those are the numbers that USDA uses, and they represent the real cost of food. Even if we do use this special metric that Ms. Howder came up with, she said it was 11%. Well, that's still about half of what folks were paying in 1940. So it's because of advances in agriculture and intense competition in the retail marketplace that food costs have come down, and American consumers are benefiting from this, and it's raising quality of life in our nation.
Could I just respond
Sure,
quickly?
sure, we don't want
I'd
to
just
keep
like
it
to
live
say-
like that.
I'd just like to say that in the 1940s, we had food rationing, so I don't think that that's a really fair point to start from.
We're getting it up somewhere. I'll move on.
Let it go.
And I think that I agree that it's a very poor metric, and it's not a metric we should be using, because if people are paying more for energy, health care, and other costs that are more expensive, of course, it looks like the food has shrunk. So let's all agree it's a really bad statistic.
Well, and
we
maybe that
shouldn't
speaks
use
to
it.
better data would give us better insights. How's that?
Yes.
And if you start in 1900, it's 50%.
Okay. All right. So let's move on and talk about what's happening to the grocery stores. And I'd like to turn to Tom. With this growing concentration we've heard about, we've heard sort of the pros and cons. Tom, can you speak to some of those issues from the Grocers Association perspective?
I don't know if is this working?
Yep.
Can you hear?
Yep.
Okay, Sheriff, thank you for being here. I appreciate the opportunity, both for the invitation from the Department of Justice and the Department of Agriculture. We've worked together on a number of these issues, particularly with the Federal Trade Commission, and I really appreciate Howard's introduction. I think the question of the growing concentration, including mergers and its effect on prices, is certainly not something that I feel qualified to address because of the fact that we don't track prices, we don't set prices, we don't have any great assessment of being able to determine whether the 10 or 20,000 items that we carry in supermarkets this day have gone up, and certainly not as the result of a merger. I think to Howard's point, and in part that I would address in my statement that I filed with DOJ, was that we've been engaged in addressing the issue of concentration before its inception, when a merger is being developed. And as Ms. Hodder mentioned, there was a rush of mergers in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. We addressed a number of those, particularly in Ahol's attempt to acquire Pathmark and Big V supermarkets in various markets, Walmart's attempt to acquire Superamericanos Migos in Puerto Rico, and a couple others. I think our point there was that it's important to address potential concentration issues before their inception. Merger policy has been a long-term effort, and there are variables that go into deciding what market share goes into consideration, what the market is, the various aspects that have to be addressed as mergers go forward. So I think it's difficult to measure what the impacts are in prices. I'm not aware of any studies by FTC or others that have measured what the increase in prices have been. I also think that it doesn't address the issue of organic growth and the effect of concentration in markets. So I don't think that there's any conclusive answer to the question as to what has been the impact of ultimate long-term concentration. But I do think it's important to address it before there is such a high increase in concentration as is outlined under the merger guidelines that the FTC follows. That's what got us engaged in those mergers in the early 2000s, late 1990s, is to address those issues, challenge the concentration that would have resulted. I also think that what we also said, that as a result of those mergers, when stores are divested, we believe that there should be given an opportunity to the independent sector to acquire those stores, to give an opportunity for market competition to be perpetuated in the market where those mergers take place. And I guess in the concluding part that I would say is that even though those mergers took place in the early 2000s, some of those divestitures did make stores available to independents that are now successful today. And there is also the fact that some of those mergers did not turn out as great as what the forecast was.
Correct. No, thank you. Thank you, Tom. I'd like to turn to Kyle, actually, for you to take this to a different place in talking about concentration. Can you talk to us a little bit about the prices that consumers pay and the prices that the stores pay to suppliers, sort of that dynamic, sort of, again, teeing off the idea that we know there's been increased merger activity and we know that there's been increased concentration.
Sure. Thank you, Sheriff, and I want to thank the Department of Justice and the United States Department of Agriculture for inviting me to this panel. My first thought when I was we were kicking around this idea of what is the impact of increased concentration, and my answer to that thought is really, where is this concentration really coming from? That's the fundamental point that I would like to make here before I talk about pricing per se. Really, what got the ball rolling in terms of all the public outcry in the retail sector has been the emergence of Walmart and Targets and these large warehouse store formats. That put in motion several other events that have really impacted the food market. One of those points is the exit of the smaller localized grocers and smaller supermarket chains around the country. And that's had a pretty big impact, in my estimation, on poor people living in rural sectors, poor people living in say, blighted urban regions, et cetera. It's required for those people, many of them that don't have cars, to have to get their food sourced maybe by taking a bus or driving with a friend or something like that. So that's been a pretty big impact on those lives. The other consequence of the arrival of these large warehouse store formats has been increased consolidation in sort of the more general supermarket sector. What we're talking about here is large chains such as Kroger, Safeway, et cetera. These chains have been involved in mergers. Other chains have been involved in mergers, sort of consolidation across large urban sectors, and the pattern there we're observing is for higher prices in that part of the market. And now you say, well, okay, higher prices in that market, that must mean market power. Well, not per se. These companies are smart. They know they can't just raise prices in every context, so they've also offered a lot more services. They've increased their store ambience and things along that nature. So there may be an exercise of market power. The crystal ball begins to look a little foggy at that point. There may be market power at play here, but there's also some changing in their strategies. Okay. So the other issue I want to address on the issue of Walmart and warehouse store formats has been one that's been studied and talked about a lot at the University of Wisconsin, and that's this issue of buyer power. And that stands to me right now as the relatively more important issue in terms of the food system, because a company like a Walmart has come in and they've really flown under the radar of any of the antitrust authorities' sort of criteria for evaluating markets. Their concern at the Department of Justice is largely on consumer welfare. There's been a lot of push, and I think one of the members of our audience, Peter Carstensen, here today, has been making that point for quite some time, that we really need to broaden our perspective on what constitutes power. And his point is very relevant to this to this audience, because one of the issues with a company like a Walmart is their ability to push down prices through the food system all the way to the farm sector. And so I would encourage the Department of Justice, United States Department of Agriculture, Federal Trade Commission, to really broaden their scope a little bit here. We're really dealing with a vertical sector that has been hammered over the last 10, 20 years, and I think it's pretty relevant in terms of income distribution and the way rural sectors have participated in the larger economy, and the way urban areas have been impacted as well. So,
thank you.
all right, thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that. I'd like to focus a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about concentration. We've talked a little bit about pricing. I'd like to focus a little bit on retail consumers' experience beyond beyond prices. Quality and variety come to mind, and I think, Mary, can I start with you to speak about those issues as a rural sociologist? Can you lighten us on those?
Well, and I think that this is really important to understand. I want to build on something that Kyle talked about and a little bit on what Howard talked about earlier, is that we've been narrowly focused on consumer welfare as price, and we've been focused on does market power do to the price. And I think we have to really expand both our definitions of what is consumer welfare and then where does power reside in the food system. And as a sociologist, this is critical for us because power is about, can you control your life chances? Some actors in the food system have more power over their life chances than others. And this is particularly important for farmers and for workers. And how does this power come about? It's not just about the economic definitions of power. And I'm really glad that Peter Carstensen and so on, these folks have been working on buyer power. But it's also about power. Power comes from lots of different places. Control over intellectual property. We heard about that this morning. It's through the standard setting. And we've talked a little bit about food safety and so on, but those food safety standards are now being set largely in the private sector. And the people that can help, that farmers and workers don't actually get to be at the table in much of that standard setting, and I would argue a lot of consumers aren't either. And so we also have powers accumulated in access to markets, and this is really critical for farmers. It's also critical for consumers. But I think also the big elephant in the room that we're not talking about, too, is access to capital. And how capital is really the name of the game, and how capital plays out in the food industry, I think, is really important. Bob Taylor from Auburn has done some really interesting research on return on investment, which is, of course, return on investment is really return on capital. It's a much better way to gauge what's happening in the food system for farmers, for producers, than some of the other things we've been talking about. And farmers haven't done very well in that. So let's talk about consumers for a minute. Access. Kyle started to talk about rural areas. What I think that the power is translated into, some entities have the ability to impose their business models on others, and these business models have really left out rural areas, and they've left out inner urban areas quite frequently. I'd give you an example of my hometown of Shickley, Nebraska, population 350 people. There is still a grocery store in that town, but it's hard for them to get deliveries because of the restructuring, the consolidation that's happened in the grocery industry and the restructuring that's happened among distributors. It's really hard for them to get deliveries. My 80-year-old mother is spry enough to still drive. Others can't. So what happens if they go out of business? But the same situation exists in Old North St. Louis, within view of the Arch. And folks there, it's at least 3 miles, many without cars, to grocery stores, and they live in a food desert. And the quality of things that they can get in Old North, the quality of things that we can get in my hometown of Shickley, are vastly different than, and a lot of this is due to the restructuring of what's happened in the grocery industry. And I think those are really important things to point out. And think about power in much broader terms in impacting people on the ground. Producers, labor, consumer on the ground. And it's not just about prices.
Okay, Eric, you represent the large retailers. Do you have a perspective on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks again for giving me the opportunity to participate. There's no question that the marketplace has changed dramatically in the past several decades. 30 or 40 years ago, consumers pretty much had to purchase all of their groceries at conventional supermarkets, but today the marketplace is much more diversified. Shoppers can purchase items through so many more retail channels now. You have supercenters, warehouse club stores, limited assortment stores, convenience stores, chain drug stores, natural and organic stores, and even online retailers are now selling groceries. And all of these retail channels are competing vigorously with one another. Competition is extremely robust. I would say it's more robust than it was back in those days. And this is resulting in low prices for consumers and more convenience, too. Many stores are open 24 hours, and the variety of items that are carried in stores has expanded. And there's not only competition on price, there's very vigorous competition on services now, too. More stores are offering prepared foods. This provides value to consumers. It saves them time. Sushi, gourmet bakeries, and top-notch delis are more commonplace. Stores are even offering cooking classes, wine tastings, flower arranging classes, and dietitians on site. And our latest poll found that store satisfaction is rising, and 9 out of 10 shoppers would recommend their primary store.
Oh, great, thank you. So they're offering more, but I guess to Mary's point, the question is where are those stores? And Winona, do you have anything you want to add to this as well from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Well, supermarkets exert power over consumers based on location. And so consumers have to spend their time and their travel dollars to get to a store. Research has shown that women spend twice as much time shopping as men, and women often also have a job outside of the home, so they don't have time to travel around to different stores to get the best deal. And probably at least 60% of Americans don't have an iPhone with an app on it to find the best deal. As far as the food deserts go, I think there's some really interesting information from some studies on rural nutrition that show that, as we would think, in these food deserts in rural counties, there's not enough nutritious fruits, vegetables, dairy products. But this study also found that many local grocery stores actually charged lower prices for basic food products that are important to a healthy diet than the superstores did. I think also that we have this illusion of choice, and grocery stores present this illusion by having many, many similar products sold by only this handful of companies. So there may be 50 kinds of potato chips, but 75% are sold by the top 4 firms. Or there are enough kids' cereals to take up a whole aisle, but they're sold by the same 4 companies. So this gives the illusion of choice, but what's actually happening is that the food and retailing industry is largely they're marketing machines, and they often target children, which is really contributing to the epidemic of childhood obesity with all of these marketing tie-ins. So foods are targeted at children by placing them at eye level, and then they're cross-marketed with cartoon or movie characters that kids recognize. And a recent Yale study found that the number of products with these commercial tie-ins to other kid-friendly products increased 78% between 2006 and 2008. And then I guess the other elephant in the room is what is the food that's actually being sold? And I think that Dr. David Kessler, who is the former Surgeon General, had some very important points about this in his book, The End of Overeating. He basically documented that the food industry scientists have developed this formula that is based on sugar, fat, and salt that alters the brain's chemistry and compels people to overeat. And grocery stores, along with the food processors, have every incentive to sell this highly processed food because that's the most profit-making, those are the most profit-making items. And then I guess I would have one more point around concentration and food safety. When there are only a few companies that are providing the ingredients for an entire food system, we have a real problem. So, we've seen it with the egg factory and the salmonella outbreak. We've seen it with peanut butter. Peanut butters or peanuts are in all sorts of products, and so it ends up destroying all sorts of food items and poisoning people. And as others have noted, many of the food companies and the farm marketers have merged in part because they're responding from the pressure from the big supermarket chains. So we've seen this kind of consolidation in these other food products that comprise the processed foods that we eat. So we have 2 firms, for instance, that control all of bagged leafy greens, and they're mostly produced in 2 counties in California. So when there is an E. coli problem in spinach, it means that most spinach has to be pulled off the grocery store shelves. These are the impacts that aren't generally, the people, even consumers, aren't generally aware of.
Thank you, Winona. Thank you. I'd like to turn to you, Al, and talk a little bit about the impact. I did. I knew it was. We definitely needed to hear from you because we wanted to. We've discussed. There's been a lot of changes. We've heard concentration. We've heard some of the suggested impacts from that concentration in grocery stores and in other food retailers. But I'd like to talk to you about sort of the supply chain and with your organization and the folks that you represent who are literally lifting and moving the items through the food chain. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing?
Sure. Before I start, let me say it's a pleasure to be here with Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture. We're really happy to see Howard here from the Federal Trade Commission. From the onset, we thought it was very important to have the FTC in this process. We're really happy you're here, and to follow up on what Secretary Vilsack said this morning. This may be the last hearing, but it's definitely not the last chapter, so let's make sure we push this work forward. I also, just want to thank Brother Lieberman down there for a great opening for me, in that I probably have a long list of retail grocery employers, suppliers, and others, probably 2 reams of paper of people that would not agree that competition is thriving and that everything is well and good on the ground in communities. Because when we've talked about the elephant in the room, but let's really talk about the elephant in the room. Walmart. If, as Howard said, the top 20 companies make up $725 billion in sales. Let's look at Walmart. They comprise $150 billion of those sales. So when you talk about their size, let's really talk about their size. Their percent of the grocery industry went from 6% in 1990 to 23% in 2009. If you look at the top 5 U.S. companies, Walmart makes twice as much as their closest competition, which is Kroger, as Howard pointed out. But they make more than Costco, Home Depot, Target, CVS combined. So really, they're not, when we talk about consolidation, when we talk about the Krogers and Safeways, they're not the ones wielding the power. Walmart's wielding the power. Talk to any supplier, probably off the record and one-on-one in the closet, usually, but they will tell you that it's not been a fun ride. The best example is one that's familiar to everyone in this room, which is Vlasic Pickle. Vlasic Pickle, many suppliers find themselves in the same situation. They go to Walmart, they're really happy to get the contract with Walmart, but they don't know what's happening until they really get in and they become dependent. It's like the drug. They're dependent, they're set, they hire based on this business, and then Walmart dictates the price. In the example of Vlasic Pickle, Walmart said, we will pay you $2.97 for a gallon of pickles. So for a short period of time, it looked like great business until their other sales in sliced pickles, cut pickles, started to decline. And so Vlasic went to their biggest, contract and said, look, we need a little help here. We need you to raise the price on one of these items, or else let us cut the cost of this gallon product from the $2.97. So Walmart refused and basically said, if you try to change the price, well, we won't sell any of your products. That's bully tactics. That's not how the supply chain should work. That's why we need the FTC to stand in here, come in here, and ensure that there's fairness in the supply chain. Farmers are not getting enough of this pie. If you look at what farmers got in 1990, they got 59% of the consumer beef dollar. If you look at what they got in 2009, it was 42%. If you go back to these communities where the Vlasics exist, Vlasic has to go back to a workforce and say, you no longer have jobs. The only way we can compete now that we've lost our biggest customer is to cut jobs, cut labor costs. And if you don't think that reverberates into the community, then we're all kidding ourselves. So really the question here is, as we look at the supply chain, is we've had a kind of a missing link. We've had no oversight over the retail grocery sector. But with that said, let's put a little asterisk on that, because we're really just talking about Walmart. They're the only ones who control the process. They're the biggest employer in the United States, biggest private sector employer, and they're dictating to suppliers, to farmers, to everyone down the chain. It is the #1 issue that we hear at the bargaining table in negotiations from these supposedly thriving competitors. They don't look at it that way. So if I say anything here today, it's that the FTC has to remain a true partner in this process. We can't let this be the final stop in terms of bringing equality and fairness into this process. And unfortunately, I have example after example of suppliers that have just been totally cut out of this process. So let's one last note, just to give you one more piece of information about how big Walmart is. Walmart has a 30% market share in 168 markets across the country. In 29 markets, they have 50% market share. And probably the best resource to talk about how we should handle that was former Walmart CEO Lee Scott himself, who said that any company that has over 30% market share should surely have oversight and investigation by the government. So I'll use Walmart's own former CEO's words in saying it's time for us to have action, because everybody else we talk about, it's not a waste of time, but we're not talking about the real issue if we're not talking about the power that Walmart wields in this arena.
Thank you. Thank you, Al. I appreciate that perspective. And I'd like to actually help us at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, Bert. You're with the Antitrust Institute. We've heard a lot of talk about concentration in power and its impact on the supply chain. Help us frame it from an antitrust perspective, if you could.
All right, let me elaborate on what Kyle and Mary said about broadening the concept about consumer welfare. When we put this into context, antitrust has focused over the years mostly on seller power. Concentrated buyer power is relatively new, and we have not put the resources into a full understanding of its impact or how it relates to an entire supply chain, the whole system. Antitrust tends to focus on narrowly defined product and geographic markets and does not take a sufficiently systemic view. Let me say that. Now, one thing that comes out of that, I think, is we've looked at monopoly as the model, and then we come to monopsony, which is where there's buyer concentration, and we try to live from the monopoly model. We say it's a mirror image, but it's not really a mirror image for a number of reasons. One is that the level of market share necessary to have disproportionate bargaining power at the buyer side is much smaller than at the seller side. For monopoly, we talk in terms of 60, 70% of the market or more. You don't find that among buyers typically. But when a buyer has 20% of a national market, it's got life and death ability with respect to the suppliers. So a couple of conceptual problems come up. One Howard mentioned, which is you might exercise buyer power in such a way that it knocks down prices to the consumer at the end of the day. And maybe that's good. But if that's all you look at, maybe it's not so good. On top of that, maybe it won't get passed on to consumers. Maybe the power buyer has so much market power in a horizontal level at the retail level that has no need to pass on. But let's leave that aside for the moment and talk about another difference. With consumer welfare focusing on the reduction of output. That's what we've been focused on for 30, 40 years primarily. Because if you have concentration and you reduce the amount of goods being produced, the price will go up. And we worry about that properly. But when we talk about buyer power, the buyer, and especially if it's a Walmart, which we take as the icon of buyer power, has the ability to offer an all or nothing arrangement. And if it's nothing, the supplier is out cold and probably can't survive. So what the buyer has is an inordinate amount of power. Mary's right. We got to be looking at power. We've got to be looking at the negotiating realities that occur in the marketplace, and not simply what the effect on the consumer price is going to be. Although that's important, but it's not the only thing of importance. So I think there may be really a third category we should look at: monopoly, monopsony, and disproportionate bargaining power. Now, what we do about that, maybe I'll save for another time, but I do want to raise another point here, and that's something called the waterbed effect. It's not necessarily something that all economists agree happens, but let me explain it because I think it's logically sensible. Let's again take Walmart as the example. If Walmart can batter down its supplier and get a lower price, a discriminatorily low price, as compared to its horizontal competitors, the other retailers, then number one, it gains a competitive advantage because it's got lower cost. It can choose to pass that on to consumers in lower prices, or it can keep it as additional profit, in which case it's got more ability to expand and do other things. The other side of that is, what happens to the other retailers? If I'm a supplier and I've got to earn a certain return on investment, a certain profit level, and as a supplier I have to give Walmart this lower price that I'm giving to my other customers, I have to find some way to maintain my profit margin, which could be to raise prices, at least relatively, to the other people I sell to. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, and you may get away with it partially, you may not get away with it, but you're put in that position. So I'm saying that this idea of disproportionate buyer power can lead to a double whammy, where the big buyer benefits from the lower price that it gets, and at the same time, probably, I think, and this is worth a lot of study, raises the rival's costs at the horizontal level. It's a double whammy, and what it leads to is an ever-increasing behemoth.
Since we're talking antitrust and delving into antitrust economics, Howard, can I ask you to respond to the issues that Bert has raised? We all struggle with monopsony power issues. I know at the department we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me make just a few brief remarks about this. Bert is absolutely right that monopsony is not, in fact, the mirror image of monopoly, and that you get all kinds of localized effects, and when you look at the margins that a supplier is working off of, which can be very slim, a much smaller market share than can give you monopoly power can give you monopsony power, and I think that this is right. There are a number of problems from an antitrust standpoint with attacking monopsony power, and let me just give, this is not to say it's not a problem, but let me talk about it as an antitrust problem first. If a powerful buyer is making final prices cheaper to consumers, antitrust is generally not going to be able to turn around and say, well, you're making things cheaper for final consumers, but there's something that you're doing in terms of bargaining with your suppliers that is unfair. That's typically not an antitrust concern. We can't get in and start to set intermediate input prices. Now, what we can do is, in the context of a merger or a consolidation event, we can look at whether such outcomes are likely, whether monopsony power is likely to be increased through the merger, and say that's a harm that we don't want to see happen and stop the merger. But what do you do when you have a firm that has gotten big not by merging, but by virtue of internal growth, like Walmart? Can we tell a Walmart, you cannot use all of your bargaining power to buy at the lowest price? That is at least well beyond the understood purview of the antitrust authorities. That gets to an issue essentially of regulation, which is something the agencies don't do. So when you talk about unfair bargaining power, I don't mean to say that that's not a problem, and I don't mean to say that there aren't possible ripple effects from that affect workers and communities and many kinds of things. But it's certainly never been in the purview of it's hard enough for the antitrust agencies to say that a monopolist is charging too high a price. To say that a powerful buyer is acting in its self-interest and getting as low a price as possible, and that's an antitrust problem is, I think, an extremely difficult thing for us to do outside of a merger kind of event.
So we have several folks that want to comment on this. Al has some comments, and Bert and Mary as well. So why don't we start? Al, you want to comment on this from the workers' perspective? Because
Sure.
you've heard from the antitrust wonks now. We've heard there may be some other theories we should be pursuing, and now you've heard, well, we pursue those, and what really happens in terms of what our antitrust laws are aimed at.
Sure, I'm not so sure it's definitely aimed towards just the workers, but what I would say is I think everyone here would recognize and admit that, as you said, Howard, this isn't a merger. They grew in a way that was not customary in past trending over the years, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fix it. And I guess what I would say is that they have flown under the radar. If you look at, as Bert said down there, that you have to look at more factors than just the sales impact in terms of what happens with quality. If you go down the chain and the supplier has to make changes just to maintain a relationship with a Walmart, then they're going to do things that are unheard of, meaning they're going to cut labor costs or they're going to compromise safety, food safety, to meet those demands. So I think we're almost challenged. We almost have a responsibility to change the way that we look at this from an antitrust perspective. I'm not saying the process exists today, but I think that, again, if I think about what Secretary Vilsack said this morning, this is the beginning of a process. So we can't ignore it. It's happening, but by not having the process in place to address it now doesn't mean, maybe that's a priority, is to develop a process to challenge this type of behavior. It's ruining American communities. It's ruining we heard from farmers earlier, from packers, virtually everybody in the supply chain is getting stripped of everything they have because of this dominance by a Walmart. And to do nothing is negligent on all our parts.
Howard wants 1 second, and then Bert. You want to say anything? Bert, you want to retort? Okay, and then we'll go. I love it. Everybody wants to talk. This is great. Bert, and then Mary, and then Eric.
A couple of quick points. Howard, Justice Department has gone after buyer cartels for a long time. And a buyer cartel where they fix prices, it's not because they're going to pass anything on to consumers, so that's well known to be illegal, number one. Number two, we say that competition is a good thing, and it's a good thing for consumers to be able to buy from competitive sellers. Why is it that suppliers don't also have a right to sell into a competitive market? I know you've got good, complicated questions there, but as a matter of theory and justice, it seems to me we need to work on that. And the country, in fact, did work on that once. It was called the Robinson-Patman Act when A&P and others were growing so strong as chains. We worried about it, but we were worried then about buyer power. We came up with a test regarding price discrimination, and we said that abuse of buyer power to get discriminatorily low prices would give you competitive advantage is illegal. Now, as it happened over the years, it's been a very difficult law to interpret, and it's been interpreted in such a way that it doesn't work that way at all. But that's another approach we have, is to either reincarnate the good parts of the Robinson-Patman Act, or to legislate, or to figure out some way to arrive at a comparable type of an approach.
So, let me just respond very briefly. Buyer cartels are a different matter. Anytime you've got a horizontal dimension, I think that the antitrust basis is much clearer. Just a couple of very quick things. I think that we certainly can, and indeed the Justice Department recently has, pursued agreements that say you cannot give our competitors as good a deal. In those kinds of situations, the raising rivals cost arguments are very high, and we've got a conduct basis for going after a firm, because it's not about the price they're paying, it's about their control over the prices their competitors are paying. And that's the kind of thing that we can and do look at. Second thing is that the antitrust agencies have not ignored monopsony. We at the FTC have had a monopsony investigation. It's public, by a company that's been oft mentioned here against a company that's been oft mentioned here this afternoon. It's not a question of ignoring it. It's a question of finding the antitrust hook. which brings me just to one broader point that I would mention. To look to antitrust alone as the policy avenue for getting at the kinds of problems that people are talking about here, I think is a mistake. And I think that a lot of communities have engaged in self-help through zoning, through other kinds of things. And I would just like to mention, antitrust can be a piece of the puzzle here. But I think there are good reasons that it's got to be a limited piece of the puzzle, lest we punish the very thing antitrust is supposed to promote, which is vigorous competition, which occasionally results in a winner. And we don't want to turn around to that winner and say, now that you've won, and you're the one firm to who these suppliers can sell to, we've got bad news for you. Suppliers have a right to sell to a competitive market, so we're going to come in and break you up. I think we can all admit that would be an extremely radical approach to antitrust, one that might bring down the whole enterprise were we to attempt it. So antitrust can be a piece of the puzzle here, but I think it's important to recognize that there are other policy avenues that are going to have to work in concert.
Well, and I think that takes us to Mary. And just to note, the case that Howard's referencing at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division is the MFN litigation that's ongoing against Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan for the pernicious MFNs that they had in place. But Mary, there are other issues, other ways of looking at these issues other than our antitrust wonks, looking at them, and help us with that.
Well, and I'm absolutely not an antitrust wonk. I don't know the law on this particular issue like Bert does, like Howard does, but I think it's important to remember that the historical antecedents of antitrust came out of a movement that was about what can competition do for citizens and for communities. And that's what we have to keep front and center. Okay, as lawyers, you're going to have to figure out how we're going to manage that. How are we going to do that? But that is essentially what we are talking about, is what can competition do for communities and citizens. And we are now operating in a global world. We have a food system that is a global food system. Smaller entities across the board are being left out of the reorganization of the food system. I've got people that are working on international agriculture who talk to me about the same issues that our farmers are facing in terms of being able to provide volume, talking about standard setting, all of these kinds of things. This is at a global level, so we have got to figure out how are we going to promote competition at a global level in terms of the benefits for communities and citizens. And if we don't figure that out quickly, it's not really going to matter. For the farmers who, Bob Taylor just told me that 0% return on investment for farmers over the last 13 years, that means that farmers are eating their equity. What does that mean for rural communities? That means that rural communities are eating their equity. There is just, I mean, this is, Al was talking about what's happening in terms of the bargaining power for laborers, which means that they're not getting wages back to them, which means that we're eating up the ability of workers to participate in the economy. Somewhere this has got to stop. We've got to look at the historical antecedents of antitrust law, and we've got to make some policies that make sense.
Thank you. Okay. Yep, I think Eric would.
I just want to emphasize that it's essential to consider consumers, and we're seeing more competition on price and services than ever before, and consumers are clearly benefiting. The real cost of food continues to decline. And this is so important, especially during these tough economic times.
Well, and let me take it, I want to take it sort of to one more level down to talk a little more specifically about price increases. Some observers have said that price increases are quickly passed on, but price decreases or cost decreases are not. And I think this is a critical issue to the discussion we're having about power and what that means. And Kyle, you've done some work in this area, and I'd love to get your perspective on that as well for all of us to benefit from.
Sure. The issue here is this phrased asymmetric pricing in the market, and what's been observed over the years in many industries has been this phenomena that cost increases, upstream cost increases, quickly get passed on to consumers, but cost decreases for a variety of reasons do not get passed on to the consumers, and so the firms that are in the vertical channel, retailers included, are taking a larger share of the pie while those cost decreases are being are being noted. So, and this is a phenomena that has a lot of theories that are being posited and been tested, and there really is no consensus about why this occurs. I have my own reasons. I mean, clearly one of them is one potential reason is this issue of oligopoly or oligopsony power. Another issue is perhaps the issue of risk management. Maybe this is one way for firms to manage uncertainty and risk in their day-to-day business. Another possibility is sort of that I'm pretty sure is occurring in the food sector, and that's this imperfect information or asymmetric information. Supermarkets, whether they be our convenience stores or Walmarts or whatever, they know they have a fairly loyal clientele. They know that consumers aren't necessarily aware of what all prices are, whether they have information through the internet or through some other new modern device. They're not really comparing prices. We're busy people, right? So you're going to go to the supermarket you've always gone to, or you're going to go to the Walmart you typically have gone to over the past, and you're going to pay those prices. You're not really going to know. There's 40,000 items in the supermarkets these days. I mean, you're not going to notice these kinds of things. So the retailer in this context is aware of that and can say, okay, I've got a price decrease today on ketchup, so I'm not going to lower the price to the consumer. I'll just take that as profit. But if they get an increase in the price of ketchup, they say, hey, I'm not going to eat that. I'm passing it on, because frankly, nobody really pays attention to a nickel or a dime change in the price of ketchup, right? And that's really what's going on here. So what does this mean? I don't think per se this means is not a gigantic issue for the consumer, but once again, what does this really mean for the farm sector? And I think it's a big issue, and here's why. And when we're talking about food, most of the cost changes through the system are related to supply shocks. Yeah, there's some big demand shocks, but they're pretty rare. I mean, you usually have to have some health scare or something like that to really get a big jump in demand. Demand's pretty constant. So what's going on here is that the cost movements in the system are largely related to supply changes. Well, so what happens when you have a cost decrease? Well, that typically is associated with a large supply coming through the system. So farmers are for some reason producing a lot of beef right now. Cost decrease is going through the system and it's not being passed on to the consumer. Well, what happens? The market doesn't clear. The market doesn't clear the supply at those previously higher prices. So subsequently, without the market clearing, if there's still more supply coming in, that's even going to lower the farm price even more. And so what happens in this context is the farmer gets whipsawed. And most of the time it would tend to be on the downside. If cost increases are being passed on to consumers are consuming less of that product, and so the farmer isn't necessarily benefiting from they're going to get hurt by decreased demand at those higher prices. So it's really, in some ways, this whole issue of asymmetric pricing in the food sector is really stacking the deck against the farmer. And it's a problem, I think, as we've gotten into greater consolidation. It's a problem that could crop up and it could become much more severe as we move forward. So one of my recommendations on this issue is we need to be very vigilant about this topic. I know this morning Tom Vilsack's comment about the hog industry brought back some memories. I think he mentioned there were 670,000 hog producers in 1980 and now there's 67,000. You could go back to the late 1990s and you could make the point and be pretty accurate that the number one reason why we had such mass exodus in the hog sector occurred when we had this phenomena where hog prices basically fell to zero, while retail pork prices didn't drop all that much. Markets didn't clear. There was an overabundance of supply. Meat packers couldn't even manage it. Coolers were full. Farmers were letting their hogs go free in Iowa just to eat the corn. They weren't even. It was a disaster of monumental proportions, and I think one of the major reasons this occurred was this phenomena of asymmetric pricing. And nowadays, these 67,000 hog farmers that are remaining are almost all under contract now, which really brings up a whole other issue of bargaining power in contracts. We don't want to go into that right now, but the whole impetus of this major move was related to this phenomena. And as we move forward, I think that's a phenomena that we have to pay attention to, and if we can devise methods to decrease the impact, I don't know that you're ever going to get it to go away, but if we can improve the reaction time on retail food prices to react to these lower costs that are coming through the system would work more efficiently.
Thank you, Kyle. Bob, from the farmer's perspective?
Well, you're right. And thinking back through some of those periods of time, I think we were down to $8 hogs for a while there, and it was cheaper to kind of park the truck at the local coffee shop and just kind of go in and beg somebody to drive that truck away for you. Take the truck, just make sure you take the hogs with you when you go. This is a challenge of price changes and the stickiness of prices at retail. I think as Kyle, as you've mentioned, there's been quite a bit of research in that direction, and that would suggest that, yes, when prices go up, they do certainly tend to move up at retail, but when they come down, it does seem to take them a while to come down at retail as well. This is something certainly that we've watched. Don't forget, though, that there are reasons why some of that happens. I'm not saying I like it by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly on the dairy side, for example, some of the dairy pricing schemes that are in place and federal milk market orders, because of the timing in which that price information is actually passed through, it kind of has to work the way that it works. I don't like it. I don't think it's necessarily the right way for things to work, but price stickiness is on the retail side is certainly one of the concerns. But understand that whether it be a Walmart, whether it be a Costco, whether it be a Kroger for that matter, that they will tend to try to price their product for a long period of time. They don't want to change the price at retail very often if they can avoid it. They want to try to avoid those price changes at the retail level. And so, yes, it does tend to mean then that when prices move down, we tend to be aware of that, hyper aware of that, if you will. So I understand what you're saying, Kyle, and don't disagree with you at all.
And I think we're running short of time, so I think I'm going to ask one more question just to try to overlay the current economic times that we're living in and get a sense of how folks are doing and what changes you're seeing in food retailing as a result. And can I start with you, Tom, on that?
Sure. I think, as I said in my statement, certainly beginning in the fall of 2008, with the change in the economic climate, we saw probably the beginning of the biggest financial crisis and the economic depression since the Greatest Depression. And that has affected not only retailers, but the whole food industry. And that has been something that we've all been adjusting to. I think if you look at our membership initially in maybe 2008, they felt, well, it's not too bad. People are not going out to eat as much. Things are okay. We're taking food back out from the restaurant people. After about 6 months, and we start seeing what's happening in the commodity markets, in 2009 being what it was with actually commodity deflation, meat starting to fall, dairy starting to fall, retailers started to say, hey, we're not having inflation anymore where we make dollars on increasing sales. We've got deflation. Commodity prices are falling. Now all of a sudden retailers are starting to talk about, well, in order to make a dollar, we have to sell more commodities. We got to move more tonnage. And I think that is one of the things that when you look at independent retailers and wholesalers, what they focused on and what they've done as a result to change their model is they've promoted more of the perimeter departments that engage in meat, produce, dairy, to compete against larger operators. And that is something that I think we have tried to partner, and I think I've talked with Mary. There are more and more state associations where retailers are promoting buying local produce, bringing it on, making it available on their parking lots, promoting it in their stores. So there are independent operators out there and local regional companies that are trying to produce and to promote products in which there is added value not only to consumers, but added value to companies that are producing within their own state, farmers and others that are growing products within their state, whether it's Ohio, Missouri, whatever. We spent yesterday, Eric and I, talking about how we address with USDA bringing operators into underserved areas, whether it's urban areas or it's rural areas. Mary mentioned a community that's only got 350 people. Our wholesalers that service those rural states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, where there's not very many people, we're looking for alternative ways to get food there, whether it's through farming communities or others. So we're not burying our heads in the sand here. We're working to make the food system better for everyone from farm to table.
Okay. Well, I can't help but ask my last question. I have one more question, and I need really like 20, 30-second answers from each of you. And I had posed this before, so the folks had a chance to prepare for this. If you had the opportunity to offer one policy recommendation in the area of food distribution and retailing, what would it be? What would be the one thing you think would have the most impact? We'll start down at this end. Bert?
I would propose a Blue Ribbon Study Commission on buyer power made up of a variety of stakeholders, given ample opportunity to do something serious, to subpoena information, and to come out with specific recommendations based on empirical analysis, which I think would impact on merger enforcement, on Section 1, Section 2, and sectoral regulation. I think it would be a good investment.
Okay. Winona?
I think that the Obama administration should make this competition and consolidation issue a top priority, and that the Department of Justice should review all of the large agriculture mergers over the past decade to determine the impact that these corporate combinations have had on the marketplace.
Okay. Mary?
I would think that what we need to do is expand our understanding of antitrust to create some sort of legal policy framework. I'm glad you guys are investigating. You can enforce the laws that are on the book right now, but we have to create some sort of policy framework that allows us to, really focus on citizen welfare, not consumer welfare, but citizen welfare, and what competition really means for our communities. Quit privileging financial capital and start to talk about all of the other social public goods, about thriving communities, good health, healthy environments. These are all antitrust issues, and they're critical.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you. We have the safest, freshest, most affordable food and agricultural system in the world. And this is because of vigorous competition in the retail sector. So this competition must be maintained. And I also think that antitrust policy must acknowledge the realities of the 21st century marketplace. There are many different new channels where retailers are getting consumers are getting their groceries from, and the policy should acknowledge that the marketplace is more diverse than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Howard, do you want to take a stab, or do you want to pass?
I'll just say that antitrust is constrained ultimately not these days by its original purposes, and I agree very much with Mary on what those were, but on what the Supreme Court has done in translating those original purposes into a very narrow set of constraints within the agencies, within which the agencies must operate. So I think we need to look beyond antitrust. One of the most important things that I think we can do is to put power in the hands of consumers and information for consumers about what the impact is of where they spend their dollar. Maybe one of the most important effects, and get consumers to understand when you spend $1 on a certain product in a certain place, it has certain kinds of ripple effects, or I think Bert called them waterbed effects. But I think we need to make sure consumers understand what's happening with their food supply and what the impact of their expenditures is. So some kind of transparency of consumer information would be a very important policy step.
Okay, Kyle?
I would echo Howard's policy recommendation in that I would like to see some sort of natural experiments being conducted on the impacts of information. Information can be a double-edged sword at times, because sometimes it can give the actual oligopolist opportunities to coordinate. So we want to move cautiously in that direction, but I think I'd like to find out more about that. If we took a case such as Madison, Wisconsin, 250,000 people in a very small supermarket sector, maybe 30 stores, we really could do something interesting. and look at the impacts of what happens when consumers have more knowledge about pricing and products and how different those prices are across that space.
Thank you. Al?
Can I answer one question with 15 parts?
We're running out of time already. So
It would be pretty simple in some respect, in that I would like to see the FTC's increase participation in this process, and by that I would mean the FTC should appoint a senior person to the interagency task force that's already been established by Department of Justice and USDA to look at antitrust issues, and to also launch a detailed investigation into potential anti-competitive practices and look beyond just the price, look at quality, look at food safety, and look at updating antitrust laws, which I believe may be outdated and not relative to what's happening in today's marketplace.
thank you. Tom?
Well, I'm going to follow Al and expand. There are two things that I think that we're really pushing retail merchants from this perspective. One is health care. Our independents reported that their health care costs the last 2 years have gone up an average of 13%. When you have those type of cost pressures being put into your operations, that obviously pushes up your margins, it pushes down our profitability. The second is, and I want to commend the Department of Justice on this, is for the actions that they brought against Visa, MasterCard, and American Express for the anti-competitive market power that they exert on the retail community in terms of charging interchange fees that you never see every time you swipe a credit card or a debit card. It costs us 2 or 3, or if you're an independent operator, sometimes 4% on every transaction is swiped through the grocery store. And every consumer, whether they pay by cash, check, debit, SNAP, WIC, they pay for that in the cost of their goods of their supermarkets. And we need to fix that problem. We need to eliminate the market power of those companies and their largest banks in passing that charge on, something that we have no control over, but it is something that we have to absorb as a cost of operation. When you think that you can swipe a debit card and it costs us 3% or 2.5% on that transaction, when it's nothing more than an electronic check that comes out of your account, that is unfair, and that is something that we can work together on, and that's something that I commend the Department of Justice for attacking, and I wish that they would continue the work.
Thank you. Well, we need witnesses. We got a trial coming up. And Bob, play cleanup for us here.
Well, it's going to sound strange, but I'm going to agree with Eric, but I'm also going to agree with Mary and Bert as well.
Okay. Okay.
I work for the farmers in the United States. I work for American farmers, and I'm very proud to work for American farmers because I do think they deliver the safest, most abundant, most affordable food supply on the planet. Thank you very much for doing that. I'd also like to say that I agree with Bert and Mary as well, and that I think really the biggest challenge that we're facing right now for this problem is this issue of how do we deal with monopsony? How do we deal with buyer power, if you will? And I want to take you down a slightly different path than what we've talked about before, in that, when you recognize that this large corporation that begins with a W, who I shall not mention, and recognize that they can decide that they want to impose production practices, for example, on our sector, and they can make that decision. And as I recall, they don't go through a comment and discussion period. They just decide. Thank you very much. And so I think that that's very important for us to figure out what the right legal recourse, also very important, the right economic structures to put in place around that in order to make sure that we're not running into problems of unintended consequences. So I would put that as very top of the list. Since we don't have that figured out, though, in the meantime, I think we also need to make sure that we do keep Capra-Volstead and the ability to allow farmers to form cooperatives to help deal with that on the other side of the house. Very important that we keep that in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all. Let's give a round of applause to our fabulous panel. Thank you very much. I appreciate your views. Nicely done. Yeah, exactly.